I'd like to introduce our next speaker. For those who are unaware, Amnesty International is a worldwide movement of people who campaign for internationally recognized human rights for all. Their supporters are outraged by human rights abuses, but inspired by hope for a better world. So they work to improve human rights through campaigning and international solidarity. They have more than 2.2 million members and subscribers in more than 150 countries and regions, and they coordinate the support to act for justice on a wide range of issues. It is my honor to introduce to you the coordinator for Sri Lanka for Amnesty International, Mr. John Argue. He has worked in community development for 35 years, emphasizing respect for human rights and social justice. In Amnesty International Canada, John served on the executive committee from 1998 until 2001 and has been the coordinator for Sri Lanka for almost 20 years. Coordinating social justice organizations in Toronto and Vancouver for the provinces of Ontario and British Columbia, respectively. He succeeded in advocating for legislative changes to improve the economic status of low-income persons. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. John Argue.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Of course, addressing a Tamil audience and a Sri Lankan audience is always a mixed pleasure these days because of the horror that we're hearing going on in Sri Lanka. But I do have some optimism that there are some positive strengths within the Sri Lankan community in total that lead us to hope for a better future in the country. Well, I like the introduction of Amnesty. I was going to say that Amnesty has over 2 million people around the world, and part of the strength of an organization supporting human rights and campaigning for human rights around the world is the very strength of so many people active in various countries around the world, and therefore bringing pressure to individual governments and groups in authority or power in different locations to respect human rights, because it's just so important, clearly, and supported by so many people in the world. And I spend my life in community development and community action, believing strongly that really it's the strength of people fighting for our rights that will lead to truth and justice. The one point I'd make in regard to Amnesty is that it's a worldwide organization with members in over 150 countries, but actually as well, there are strong local associations in particular countries, so Canada among them, where in over 80 different countries in the world, there are offices and active sections so that Amnesty International Canada can add to the work of the international organization. And that's an important context for dealing with Sri Lanka in Canada because of the large diaspora that is here in Canada, and it offers a great strength, I think. I lament that the country's government is not using it as strongly as it might right now, as Karen just indicated. However, I'm pleased that Linda Duncan, as a federal MP, was here representing one of the active political parties in our parliament, and I believe strongly, and I'll elaborate just a little bit, about what we can do in Canada together, Tamils and Amnesty members and Sinhalese in this country, to bring human rights into effect in Sri Lanka. And I think the main thrust of my argument will be that Amnesty respects and promotes the human rights of everybody. And it's really important, I think, in arguing for Tamil human rights that are so abused, have been so abused recently, to recognize the importance of promoting Sinhalese human rights too. One of my real worries is that the current government and its actions in regard to Tamils in the camps and people in the camps, and in regard to the general legislation in the country, its treatment of journalists, its general approach to government, is really fearful for democracy and for the rights of everybody on the island. So I think it's really important to talk of everybody's human rights. Amnesty has been concerned with human rights violations in Sri Lanka actually since 1971. I'll just give just a brief highlight. Clearly, there was a JVP uprising that year, and for the first time, in my memory at least, Amnesty mentioned the problems of human rights violations in Sri Lanka in its annual report for that year. And unfortunately, I think I think Sri Lanka has probably been mentioned in every annual report by Amnesty since then in various ways, with human rights violations against the Sinhalese, with the JVP uprising, and of course with the Tamils, with the conflict with the LTTE. And so Amnesty has been concerned over the years with asserting the human rights of both sides and mentioning the human rights of each part of the population, as well as Muslims, in our reports each year. The prospect of Amnesty International in Canada working for human rights in Canada is really enhanced, in Sri Lanka, is really enhanced by the strength of a group that's represented here, actually, and as part of the group, I think, bringing together this conference, and that's the Canadian Tamil Congress. I think it's an excellent organization that is working hard for the population, and I look forward, actually, as a person active in Amnesty, in working with CTC members in actions that can improve human rights in Sri Lanka. I want to just say some of the issues that Amnesty has been concerned with this year. I mean, this year has been a frightful year in Sri Lanka. Our most frequent statements in press releases by Amnesty has stressed the safety of civilians caught in the conflict, of course, between the Sri Lankan army and the LTTE in Lavani, and accusations going back and forth as to whose fault it is. But Amnesty has been emphasizing the safety of the civilians themselves, the people, for goodness sake, and mainly Tamils, who were caught in the middle. It's just so frightful as an organization really concerned with helping individual concerns and wanting to help people's rights, to see the rights completely violated just so inconsiderately. Amnesty, as well as individual countries and other international NGOs, have asked repeatedly for temporary truces or for ceasefires, opening humanitarian corridors so that people could escape that conflict. But as you know, during this entire year, that didn't happen until the horrors in the final stages of the conflict, when even more thousands of people were killed. So the safety of civilians and the safety of people have been our major concern this year. Freedom of expression and the rights of journalists is another key one, and related, of course. It's scandalous in a country that calls itself a democracy not to allow journalists in to observe what is going on in an area where the world is interested, because the world knows, on account of some of the reports that have got out, that Tamil human rights, in particular in the Lavani, have been violated. It's utterly scandalous. I was speaking with Stuart Bell in the National Post at a University of Toronto conference a little while ago, and he was in Sri Lanka in May and not allowed, of course, to get to the particular area. He said it's ironic because in areas of conflict that journalists cover, often journalists can get to a neighboring country and get information and so learn what's going on. But in Sri Lanka, it's so difficult. You get into a boat, then you'd be vulnerable to the Navy and be blown out of the water, or you don't know where you're going to land and therefore be vulnerable to stepping on a landmine. It is just an impossible situation.